Malaga, Western Australia, 2026. The showroom floor at Beyond Tools. Two Woodfast M910 wood lathes sit side by side. Same badge, same model number, same word in horizontal font. One weighs 500 pounds. Cast iron, made at 912 Port Road, Woodville, South Australia, in 1978. The serial number was stamped by a fitter named Graham Dowling. The other is Lathe, cast in Laoshan District, Qingdao, Shandong Province, China. Priced at approximately 3,995 Australian dollars. Made by Qingdao Jinling Electric Company in 2024. Both machines carry the Woodfast trademark. Both are called M910, only one was made by Australians. 85 years after Bonar Powell and John Hagan opened a workshop in Woodville on the 11th of June, 1941, exactly 1 year to the day after Robert Menzies signed the Department of Munitions into being, the Woodfast that made the first machine no longer exists. The one that made the second is Chinese. If you ever trained on a Hercules 9-inch, turned a bowl on a Woodfast M910 in a TAFE workshop, or wondered why the badge outlasted the country that made it, hit subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. Two M910s. Beyond Tools opened in 1986 as for wood tools and machinery sales. Its warehouse and showroom sit in Malaga, a light industrial suburb 12 kilometres northeast of the Perth GPO. Tony Mirabile, the founder, has been in the woodworking machinery trade for 4 decades. On the floor today, a Woodfast WL5220A 20-inch heavy-duty lathe. Approximately 3,995 Australian dollars. Beside it, a Woodfast M910. The M910 designation dates to the 1970s. The badge on the front dates to the 1940s. Both are unchanged. 6,000 kilometres northeast of Malaga, in a factory Beyond Tools has never visited, both machines were cast, machined, assembled, tested, boxed and shipped. That factory is Qingdao Jinling Electric Company in the Laoshan district of Qingdao, founded 1991. Between 300 and 450 employees, 24,000 square metres, 13 production lines. Up to 500,000 woodworking machines a year, exported to Germany, Italy, Austria, the Czech Republic, the United States and Australia. The Woodfast M910 is one of those machines, the M910 that came off a South Australian shop floor in 1978. The M910 that a Western Australian wood turner bought second-hand in the 1990s and has used every Saturday morning since, is not on the Beyond Tools showroom floor. That machine has never been for sale in a showroom. It came out of Port Road, Woodville. It ended up in a shed in the Perth suburbs. The Woodfast that made that machine, Woodfast Machinery Co, Adelaide, no longer manufactures anything. The Woodfast that made the machine on the Beyond Tools showroom floor is Qingdao Jinling Electric Company, a wholly Chinese firm operating an Australian brand name under a licence granted in 2004. Both machines are called Woodfast M910. Only one was made in Woodville. The other is a Chinese lathe with an Australian badge. But this story does not begin in a Beyond Tools showroom in Malaga in 2026. It begins in a workshop in Woodville, South Australia on the 11th of June 1941, exactly 1 year to the day after Robert Menzies signed into law the Department of Munitions that would arm the Pacific War. Chapter 2. The Toolmakers of Woodville. The 11th of June, 1941. Woodville, South Australia. Two young toolmakers, Bonar Powell and John Hagan, register a partnership. Trading name, P&H Tools, S.A. Powell first, Hagan second. Their workshop stands in Woodville, an industrial suburb 8 kilometres northwest of the Adelaide GPO. Woodville has been transformed over the preceding 12 months by the wartime munitions surge. Premier Thomas Playford has drawn to South Australia. The General Motors Holden Woodville plant, a short distance east, is retooling for military production. 3 kilometres northwest lies the Hendon Small Arms Ammunition Factory. 2 kilometres due north sits the Finsbury Munitions Factory, opened February 1941. 10 kilometres further northeast, on the plains outside Salisbury, 3,000 men are pouring concrete for the largest explosives factory in Australian history. Powell and Hagen open their doors into this. They do not make munitions. They make precision engineers' hand tools. Squares, micrometers, machinists' rules, precision instruments for a country arming itself. The biographical record of Bonar Powell and John Hagen. Before that day in June 1941 is thin. No birth registration for either has been located in publicly accessible South Australian records. No prior employer is named. No trade paper obituary has been found for Powell. Hagen's later career is traceable through the company's own historical page. But of the men themselves, before Woodville, the record is silent. What is documented is what they built. 1944. Powell and Hagen produced their first woodworking machine, a small belt and disc sander marketed under the trade name Woodfast. The origin of the name is undocumented. What it evokes is exactly what it says. Wood worked fast. A 4-inch buzzer and jointer follows. Then a 14-inch cast-iron bandsaw that begins a 30-year supply relationship with McPherson's Hardware. McPherson ships Woodfast bandsaws into every Australian hardware showroom from Perth to Cairns. 1946. The partnership discontinues engineers' hand tools. John Hagen becomes sole proprietor. Whether Bonar Powell exited voluntarily, was bought out, or died is not recorded in any accessible source. What is recorded, the Hagen family will own Woodfast for the next 58 years, 1950. The company renames Woodfast Machinery Company, October 1950. Hagen buys the Port Road, Woodville site, corner of Findon Road, 2 acres, the address that will become synonymous with the Woodfast brand for the next 59 years. But before the Woodville workshop could arm a nation of woodworkers, before McPherson's could sell Woodfast bandsaws in every Australian hardware store, before Graham Dowling could walk through the Port Road gate. As a 16-year-old apprentice. A different Adelaide, 1 year to the day earlier, had already begun to arm the country against a very different threat. Chapter 3. 1 year to the day, the 11th of June, 1940. Melbourne. Prime Minister Robert Menzies signs into law the national security regulations that formally establish the Department of Munitions. It is 1 week after the last British soldier is evacuated from Dunkirk. It is the day Australia accepts that Britain cannot arm the Empire alone. The man Menzies appoints as Director General is Essington Lewis, Managing Director of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company. 59 years old. Born Burra, South Australia, 13th of January, 1881. On the wall of his office at Munitions headquarters in Melbourne, framed in block capitals, I am work. Lewis's charter, later described by cabinet colleagues, was as wide as the seas and as high as the sky. Ultimate control over all ordnance, all explosives, all ammunition, all small arms, all aircraft, all vehicles, and critically for this story, all the machine tools used to make them. Premier Thomas Playford of South Australia secures a disproportionate share of the wartime industrial windfall for his state. He argues Adelaide's central location and distance from the northern approaches make it defensible. Cabinet agrees. The Adelaide toolmaking milieu explodes across the following 12 months. FDU Hercus at the Barton expands. Perry Engineering at Mile End expands. Richards Industries at Keswick expands. Islington Railway Workshops takes on Beaufort sub-assemblies. Hendon Small Arms Ammunition Factory ramps to 100 million rounds a year. Finsbury Munitions Factory opens in February 1941. Salisbury Explosives Factory rises from bare paddock across late 1940 and 1941. By June 1941, Woodville is not a suburb of Adelaide anymore. It is an industrial ring around a wartime capital. Read that again. Exactly 1 year to the day after Menzies signs the Department of Munitions into being on the 11th of June 1941. Two young toolmakers named Bonar Powell and John Hagan open a workshop in Woodville, 10 kilometres from Salisbury, 5 from Hendon, 2 from Finsbury, 4 from GMH Woodville. They do not make munitions. They make precision engineers' hand tools. But they open their doors into a Woodville transformed by the war economy Essington Lewis has built. The company Powell and Hagan built at Woodville would not, in any documented sense, arm the war. But it would inherit the industrial ecosystem that did, and that inheritance would carry Woodfast for the next 63 years. Chapter 4. The Sander and the Bandsaw, 1944. Woodville. Powell and Hagan produced their first woodworking machine, a small belt and disc sander, cast iron body, marketed under the trade name Woodfast. It sells. A 4-inch buzzer jointer follows. Then the machine that will define Woodfast for the next 4 decades, a 14-inch cast iron bandsaw. McPherson's Limited, the Sydney-Melbourne hardware distributor, established 1860 in Melbourne. By 1944, the largest hardware and machinery retailer in Australia. Signs a supply agreement with Powell and Hagan. The relationship will last 30 years. Woodfast bandsaws ship into every McPherson's showroom from Perth to Cairns. Farmers buy them. Cabinet makers buy them. Boat builders buy them. A country that has just finished making bomber wings on rail shed lathes has, in the post-war years, hobbies again. 1946. Engineers' hand tools are discontinued. John Hagan becomes sole proprietor. Whether Bonar Powell was bought out, retired voluntarily or died is not recorded in any accessible public source. What is recorded, the Hagan family will own Woodfast for the next 58 years, 1950. The company renames Woodfast Machinery Co, October 1950. Hagan buys the Port Road, Woodville site, 2 acres, corner of Fine Don Road, the address that will become synonymous with Woodfast for the next 59 years, until the 1st of December 2009, when the last Woodfast truck leaves Port Road for the last time. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the product line expands. Wood lathes enter the range. The M910 lathe, the model number that will define Woodfast to a generation of Australian apprentices, enters production. 500 pounds of cast iron, heavy-duty class, cast headstock, solid tailstock, made to be used every day for 50 years. The M910 ships into TAFE workshops across South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Western Australia. It becomes the machine every Australian apprentice woodworker learns on. A boy in Elizabeth turning his first bowl learns on a Woodfast M910. A boy in Broken Hill learning to shape a chair leg learns on a Woodfast M910. A boy in Rockhampton learning to spindle, turn a stair baluster, learns on a Woodfast M910. Approximately 1967. A 16-year-old boy named Graham Dowling walks through the Port Road gate for the first time. He signs an apprenticeship indenture. Bonar Powell has been gone from the company for more than 2 decades. John Hagan is in his 50s. Woodfast has been trading under that name for 23 years. Graham will still be walking through Woodfast gates 56 years later. But Woodfast did not grow in a vacuum. The Woodville that Powell and Hagan had opened their workshop into in 1941 was by 1945 the industrial heart of the Adelaide cluster that had armed the Pacific. The men who ran those cluster factories were Woodfast's neighbours, Woodfast's customers and Woodfast's suppliers. Chapter 5. I Am Work. May 1940. Melbourne. Prime Minister Robert Menzies appoints Essington Lewis, Managing Director of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, as Director General of Munitions. Lewis is 59 years old, born the 13th of January 1881 in Burra, South Australia. He has led BHP since 1926. He is the most powerful industrialist in the country. On the wall of his office at Munitions headquarters in Melbourne, framed in block capitals, I Am Work. The 11th of June, 1940. The Department of Munitions is formally established. Lewis places every South Australian machine shop, every engineering firm, every foundry, every railway workshop on a war footing. Contracts at actual cost, plus a margin, usually 10%. No competitive tender. No negotiation. January 1942. Lewis's powers are extended. He becomes Director General of Aircraft Production as well. He now controls both munitions and airframes. The Adelaide plants convert. F. W. Hercus of the Barton, founded by Frederick William Hercus in May 1920, becomes the largest machine tool producer in the Southern Hemisphere. Under the Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges, Hercus produces in excess of 2,300 machines during the war. The Hercus 9-inch swing lathe, a South Bend clone built at the War Department's request for the small arms factories, becomes the workhorse of Australian industry. 15,000 9-inch and 8,000 later Model 260 lathes will be built over the company's life. 23,000 lathes. Adelaide made. Perry Engineering at Mile End, founded by Samuel Perry, 1865 to 1930, the largest engineering company in South Australia by 1916. In the Second World War, major munitions component maker plus 75-foot steel tugs across 1944 and 1945. T.J. Richards and Sons, renamed Richards Industries Limited, in September 1941. The Keswick and Mile End South plants. From mid-1942, producing wing panels, centre sections and fuselages for the Bristol Beaufort bomber. Also Lancasters. Also the CAC Wirraway. Islington Railway Workshops, Beaufort Mainplane and Central Component Production, feeding the 700 aircraft Beaufort program. Hendon Small Arms Ammunition Factory, one of the largest small arms plants in the Southern Hemisphere at wartime peak, produced .303 rifle rounds by the 100 million. Finsbury Munitions Factory opened in February 1941 on a 50-hectare site with approximately 4,000 workers, many of them women, and produced cartridge cases and fuses. Designed by engineer John Adrian Farger, served by a rail spur running from Woodville Station. Salisbury Explosives Factory, the largest in Australia. Built November 1940 to November 1941. Approximately 3,000 workers. GMH Woodville, the General Motors Holden plant 4 kilometres from Powell and Hagan's workshop, was retooled for Beaufort airframe components, armoured car bodies, anti-tank guns, and Bofors gun tractors. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. The rail spur that carried cartridge cases from the Finsbury Munitions Factory to Woodville Station in 1942 ran within 600 metres of the Woodville workshop, where Bonar Powell and John Hagan were, at that exact moment, making precision engineers' hand tools for civilian sale. 600 metres. 2 minutes walk. Here's the thing. Powell and Hagan did not make war material. No National Archives contract lists Woodfast. No Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges roster names it. Woodfast's first product, the belt and disc sander, would not appear until 1944. Its bandsaw contract with McPherson's was post-war. Its lathes were post-war. But Woodfast grew up in the shadow of the plants Lewis armed. It inherited the workforce those plants trained. Every fitter and turner Woodfast hired in the 1950s had trained on a Hercus lathe under a Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges apprenticeship. Every foundry in South Australia that supplied Woodfast castings had, in 1942, cast bodies for 25-pounder shells. Every draftsman who ever drew a Woodfast bandsaw schematic had learned his trade under wartime apprenticeship contracts administered by the Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges. The Adelaide toolmaking milieu was not something Woodfast joined. It was something Woodfast was made from. The Woodville that Powell and Hagan opened their workshop into on the 11th of June, 1941, 1 year to the day after the Department of Munitions was established, was the wartime industrial heart of South Australia. And when that industrial heart began to fail, 60 years later, Woodfast would fail with it. If you've made it this far through the Woodville workshop, the Salisbury explosives factory, the Hercus lathes on TAFE floors from Perth to Rockhampton, and the men who worked all three, hit the like button and subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Bandsaw serial number, apprenticeship indenture, or Port Road payslip, drop it in the comments. Chapter 6. Port Road, October 1950. John Hagan buys the 2-acre site on the corner of Port Road and Findon Road, Woodville. Purchase price is not disclosed in any accessible record. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the factory expands. Woodworking machinery becomes the sole business. Bandsaws, buzzers, jointers, thicknessers, sanders, and increasingly, wood lathes. June 1965. Documented figure, the only headcount figure ever verified in the accessible archive, 61 employees at the Port Road plant. 21 distinct machine types in production. 12% of Woodfast's output goes overseas. The company ships into TAFE workshops from Perth to Cairns, into apprenticeship schools from Broken Hill to Wollongong, into every Australian shed that ever housed a serious hobbyist. The Woodfast M910 becomes the machine every South Australian apprentice trains on. Approximately 1967. Graham Dowling walks through the Port Road gate at 16. He signs the papers. He will still be walking through those gates 37 years later, when the papers of a very different kind will be signed. 1980. The Port Road factory expands to 360,000 square feet. Woodfast is by now the dominant Australian woodworking machinery manufacturer. 1984. John Hagan retires. He has led the company for more than 40 years. His replacement as Managing Director, Bronte Edwards. 1984, the same year, a new showroom and administration complex is completed on the Port Road frontage. Cost, approximately 300,000 Australian dollars. It is the physical announcement that Woodfast has arrived. 1984, the same year. On the 30th of May, in Canberra, Senator John Button announces the Motor Industry Development Plan. Vehicle tariffs will fall from 57.5% to 15% by 2000. The Woodfast showroom rises on Port Road at the exact historical moment John Button begins dismantling the tariff structure that has made Adelaide machine tool manufacturing viable. Neither Bronte Edwards, nor Graham Dowling, nor any of the 61 Port Road employees fully understand what has just happened. The tariff cut that had begun on the 18th of July 1973 would not close Woodfast in that year or the next or the one after. But every year after 1973, the machine tool industry that Woodfast belonged to shrank. Chapter 7. The Cascade, 18th of July, 1973, 7 p.m, Canberra. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and Trade Minister Jim Cairns announce a 25% across-the-board cut to all Australian import tariffs. Effective midnight, Australian machine tool manufacturing faces imported competition for the first time since the wartime protection wall went up. Between 1973 and 1980, Australian manufacturing employment falls by approximately 80,000 jobs. The Adelaide cluster begins to contract. 30th of May 1984. Senator John Button announces the Motor Industry Development Plan. Vehicle tariffs to fall from 57.5% to 15% by 1992. May 1988. Prime Minister Bob Hawke's economic statement, the largest general tariff cut since Whitlam's 25% quarter. The general manufacturing rate is placed on a downward glide path. 12th of March, 1991. Treasurer Paul Keating's One Nation statement extends the tariff cuts to the year 2000. 1997. Prime Minister John Howard freezes the passenger vehicle tariff at 15%, but the machine tool tariff has already gone. The manufacturing environment Woodfast grew up in has ended. 2000. Manufacturing tariff at 15%. 2005, 10%. 2010, 5%. Here's the thing. Woodfast did not shut down in any of these years. It kept trading. It kept selling M910 lathes. Bronte Edwards ran the shop. Graham Dowling was on the floor. But every year, more of the components Woodfast sourced came from overseas. Every year, fewer apprentices came through the door, because the TAFE workshops that bought Woodfast lathes were themselves shrinking. Australian apprenticeships had peaked at 161,000 in 1990. By 1994, they had fallen to 131,000. The training pipeline that had fed Woodfast's customer base for 40 years was closing. And Woodfast's Adelaide same-lane peer, F.W. Hercus of the Barton, the company that had built 23,000 lathes across 85 years, showed Woodfast what the ending looked like. Chapter 8. What Hercus Did. F.W. Hercus, founded May 1920 by Frederick William Hercus, Paynham Road, then Anderson Street, Southwark from 1939. Then Regency Park, 23,000 lathes across the company's life. The Hercus 9-inch swing became the standard Australian workshop lathe, the machine every Australian tradesman under 60 learned on. The Hercus name was to Australian machine tools what the Hoover name was to American vacuum cleaners. 1987. After deep financial trouble driven by imported machine tool competition, the same tariff cuts that Powell and Hagan's successors were watching from Port Road, Hercus is sold to the Durden Group. The Hercus family exits. Machine tool production winds down through the 1990s. 2001. Hercus makes its last all-Australian made machine, the 10-inch South Bend GS26 075, built at South Bend's own request. Ironic ending for a company that had built its reputation on South Bend clones 80 years earlier, approximately 2005. Hercus machine tool production formally ends. The Regency Park site continues as a general engineering business under Durden ownership. The lathe business dies. 23,000 Adelaide-made lathes, 85 years, gone. Let that number sit for a moment. 23,000 lathes, 85 years. Every Australian technical college and trade school workshop in the 1950s, 60s and early 70s, and every TAFE workshop from 1974 onwards had a Hercus in it. Every South Australian tradesman under the age of 70 today learned to turn on a Hercus. And by 2005, that company, the largest machine tool maker in the Southern Hemisphere at its peak, no longer existed as a manufacturer. If you were Bronte Edwards, sitting in the Port Road office in 2003, watching Hercus die 4 kilometres away across Woodville, you were watching your own industry die in real time. If you were Graham Dowling on the Woodfast shop floor, watching the trucks unload imported components from Taiwan and China because the local castings foundry no longer took orders for cast iron lathe beds, you were watching the ecosystem that had made you a tradesman disappear. The question at Port Road by the early 2000s was not whether, it was how. And on a day in 2004, the exact date not recorded in any accessible public source, Woodfast Machinery Co chose how. Chapter 9. 2004, Port Road, Woodville, South Australia. Woodfast Machinery Co. Signs papers with Qingdao Jinling Electric Company of Laoshan District, Qingdao, Shandong Province, China. The transfer is not what most Australian brand offshorings look like. It is not a full corporate acquisition. It is not a receivership fire sale. It is not, as far as any public record shows, driven by insolvency. There is no ASIC Administrator's Notice for 2004. There is no advertiser front page. There is no AMWU press release. What Woodfast transfers is specifically the following: the design and manufacturing rights for 2 lathe models, the C1000 and the M910. And the single-word trademark Woodfast, in horizontal font, 2 blueprints, 1 word, 1 Chinese company. Read that again. 2 blueprints, 1 word, 1 Chinese company. Not the factory, not the workforce, not the tooling, not the company itself. Just the drawings and the name. The Adelaide Woodfast Machinery Co keeps trading. It continues at 912 Port Road. It continues to distribute machinery, increasingly imported. Bronte Edwards continues as managing director. Graham Dowling continues on the floor. But the M910, the heavy-duty cast-iron lathe that had defined Woodfast for 4 decades, is now, in law, a Qingdao product. The individual who signed the papers on the Australian side is not named in any accessible public record. No press release, no advertiser story, no Hansard reference, no AMWU response. No obituary or interview since. The papers were signed quietly. The Qingdao executive who signed on the QCR side is not named either. QCR would formally register the Woodfast trademark in 2014, 10 years after the transfer, when the machines it had been building under the licence had established a market presence significant enough to warrant formal trademark protection. Sale price, not disclosed. Not in ASIC records. Not in Chinese state disclosures. Not on the Woodfast historical page. Not in any accessible archive. Employment at the Adelaide plant immediately before the transfer, not documented. Employment lost after the transfer, not documented. What is documented is what was sold. 2 blueprints, 1 weight word, 1 country. That is what Woodfast, the Australian company, sold on that day. The buyer's factory in Laoshan was 5 years old at the time of the transfer. QCR had been founded in 1991. The 2 blueprints, one for the C1000, one for the M910, represented 40 years of Adelaide toolmaking iteration, of Powell and Hagen and their successors refining cast iron beds and headstock alignment across 4 decades. That accumulated knowledge transferred to QCR in the form of technical drawings. Blueprints can be copied. Institutional memory cannot. And on the 1st of December 2009, 5 years, 5 months, and roughly 3 weeks after those papers were signed, Woodfast Machinery Co left Port Road for the last time. Chapter 10. Royal Park, 1st of December 2009. Woodfast Machinery Company, Australia Proprietary. Limited relocates from 912 Port Road, Woodville to 1174 Old Port Road, Royal Park, 6 kilometres away. The move is not marketed as a closure, it is marketed as a modernisation. New premises, better logistics, consolidated operations. The reality, the Port Road factory that had made lathes for 59 years is no longer needed. Manufacturing is in Qingdao. The Royal Park address is a distribution and service operation. A new corporate entity, Woodworking Solutions Proprietary Limited, is formed at Royal Park. Its principals, Graham Dowling and a colleague known only as Steve, both are ex-Woodfast men. Both have decades on the Port Road floor. Graham Dowling is now approximately 58 years old. He has been at Woodfast since he was 16. He does not fully retire. He runs Woodworking Solutions from Royal Park, selling and servicing the Chinese-made Woodfast lathes his company had, 5 years earlier, sent the blueprints for. Steve joins him. Steve's surname does not appear in any accessible record. Through the 2010s, Woodworking Solutions continues. Graham Dowling walks into Royal Park each morning. He services machines he built himself 30 years earlier. He services machines he sent the blueprints for 5 years earlier. Sometimes both machines are on the workshop floor on the same day. The Adelaide-made M910 and the Qingdao-made M910, side by side, waiting for parts. Same badge, different weight, different castings, same customer. Graham writes a Facebook post in 2023, a message on the Australian Woodworkers Facebook page that reads, in his own words, I, Graham, started as an apprentice with Woodfast 56 years ago, and it doesn't seem that long ago. 56 years, 1967 to 2023. From the Port Road floor to the Royal Park distribution counter. From the machines Bonar Powell and John Hagan cast in Woodville to the machines Qingdao Jinling Electric Company cast in Laoshan. Between approximately 2018 and 2022, the exact date not recorded, Woodworking Solutions ceases trading. Graham Dowling retires. Steve retires. The last Adelaide business carrying the Woodfast name in a working sense closes. The Woodfast brand does not die. It has, by 2021, a new Australian steward, Tony Mirabile, of Beyond Tools in Malaga, Western Australia. Beyond Tools was founded in 1986 by Mirabile, originally as for wood tools and machinery sales. Its wholesale arm, Jakra Industries, in 2021 formally partners with QCR to redevelop the Woodfast brand. Here's the kicker. 17 years after 2 blueprints and 1 word were sold to Qingdao, an Australian distributor partners with the Chinese owner to bring the Woodfast brand back to Australian showrooms as an imported machine. The Woodfast M910 you can buy from Beyond Tools in Malaga today is not the M910 that Powell and Hagan designed. It carries the same model number. It carries the same word in horizontal font. It is made in Qingdao. It is distributed from Malaga. It is not, in any sense, that would be recognised by the men who trained Graham Dowling, an Adelaide machine. And if you walk into Beyond Tools in Malaga today, you can buy a Woodfast M910 wood lathe for approximately $3,995 Australian dollars. It weighs less than the one Graham Dowling used to build. It comes from a factory Graham has never seen. Chapter 11. The same model number. Walk into the Beyond Tools showroom in Malaga, Western Australia today. Turn left past the entrance. The Woodfast section. On the floor, a Woodfast WL520A 20-inch heavy-duty lathe. Retail price approximately $3,995 Australian dollars. Beside it, a Woodfast M910. The badge is the same badge that sat on the machines Bonar Powell and John Hagan shipped from Port Road, Woodville, in the 1970s. The model number is the same model number Graham Dowling stamped on machines in 1978. The company that made the machine on the showroom floor is Qingdao Jinling Electric Company of Laoshan District, Shandong Province, China. The company that made the machine Graham Dowling stamped in 1978 no longer exists as a manufacturer. 6,000 kilometres away at 912 Port Road, Woodville, the corner of Findon Road, the 2-acre site Woodfast bought in October 1950 either still stands empty of purpose or has been demolished for something else. The public record does not confirm which. There is no heritage plaque. There is no marker to indicate that this was the address of the largest Australian-made woodworking machinery manufacturer of the 20th century. Lesson 1. Manufacturing is not the machine. It is the men who made it. Bonar Powell and John Hagan founded Woodfast in a Woodville workshop on the 11th of June, 1941. They trained apprentices. Those apprentices trained apprentices. Graham Dowling started at 16 in 1967. He worked the Port Road floor for the next 37 years. When the 2 blueprints and the 1 word were sold to Qingdao in 2004, the machines could be replicated. The men could not. Every Australian apprentice trained on a Woodfast lathe was trained by a man trained by a man trained by Powell or Hagan. That chain broke in 2004. It has not been re-established. Manufacturing is not the machine. It is the men who made it. Lesson 2. A trademark is not a country. The Woodfast M910 you can buy today carries the same model number as the M910 Graham Dowling stamped in 1978. It carries the same badge. It carries the same word in horizontal font. It is not the same machine. It weighs less. It is cast in Qingdao. It is assembled in Laoshan. It is distributed from Malaga. It is designed by engineers who never met Powell or Hagan. A trademark is not a country. A model number is not a workforce. A badge is not a lineage. The Woodfast brand survives. What made it Woodfast does not. Lesson 3. Some families sell, some families keep. In November 2023, the Keir family sold a Kubra, the Kempsey hat maker, 5 generations, 140 years, to Andrew and Nicola Forrest's Tatarang. Australian to Australian. The Kempsey factory kept trading. The 120 employees kept their jobs. In January 2024, David John Heine, chairman of John Heine and Son, the Sydney Machine Tool Foundry, signed voluntary liquidation papers on the family's 5-generation, 137-year-old company. He said publicly and in his own words, quite often the family outgrows the company. No offshoring, a dignified end. In 2004, someone at Woodfast Machinery Co signed papers transferring 2 blueprints and 1 word to Qingdao. No press release. No named signatory. No dignified end. 3 Australian families. 3 endings. Some sell to keep. Some wind down with dignity. Some ship offshore and let the name outlive the country. All 3 are choices. Only 2 are honest. 11th of June, 1940. The Department of Munitions established. 11th of June, 1941. Woodfast founded. 1 year to the day apart. Read that again. 1 year to the day. The Adelaide toolmaking milieu Essington Lewis built. Between June 1940 and June 1945, Hercus, Perry, Richards, Islington, Hendon, Finsbury, Salisbury, GMH Woodville was the ecosystem Woodfast grew up in. By 2004, Hercus had stopped making all Australian machines. Perry Engineering was demolished. Richards had been Chrysler, then Mitsubishi, then closed. Islington was gone. Hendon was gone. Finsbury was gone. Salisbury was gone. GMH Woodville was on countdown to closure at Elizabeth. When Woodfast signed the papers for the blueprints and the word, there was no Adelaide machine tool cluster, left for it to stay inside of. The M910 sits in Beyond Tools showrooms today. The badge is the same. The machine is not. 85 years since Powell and Hagen opened the workshop. 63 years from the founding to the sale. 22 years from the sale to the present. The brand survives. The men who made it do not. She's a beauty.